The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. His most famous theory was a brilliant failure. He suggested that the universe was composed of 27 transparent and therefore invisible spheres, revolving in diverse directions and at various speeds about the center of the earth, and that the heavenly bodies were fixed upon the periphery or shell of these concentric spheres. The system now seems fantastic, but it was one of the first attempts to give a scientific explanation of celestial behavior. In accord with it, Eudoxus calculated with considerable accuracy, if we may rashly take our present knowledge of these matters as a norm, the synodic and zodiacal periods of the planets. The theory did more than any other in antiquity to stimulate astronomic research. Ecphantus of Syracuse wrote about 390, "The earth moves about its own center in an eastward direction." Heraclides of Pontus, one of the great polymaths of antiquity, the author of famous works on grammar, music, poetry, rhetoric, history, geometry, logic, and ethics, took up the suggestion, or advanced it independently, arguing that instead of the whole universe revolving about the earth, the relevant phenomena can be explained by supposing that the earth itself rotates daily upon its axis. Venus and Mercury, said Heraclides, revolve around the sun. For one brilliant moment, perhaps, Heraclides anticipated Aristarchus and Copernicus, for we read in the fragments of Geminus, circa 70 B.C., Heraclides of Pontus said that even on the assumption that the earth moves in a certain way, while the sun is in a certain way at rest, the apparent irregularity with reference to the sun can be saved. We shall probably never know just what Heraclides meant. Meanwhile, a modest progress was being made in the sciences. In geography, Dicaearchus of Messana, the biographer of Greece, measured the height of mountains, established the circumference of the earth at some 30,000 miles, and noted the influence of the sun upon the tides. In 325, Nearchus, one of Alexander's generals, sailed from the mouth of the Indus along the southern coast of Asia to the Euphrates. His log, partly preserved in Arrian's Indica, was one of the classics of ancient geography. Geodesy, the measurement of land surfaces, elevations, depressions, positions, and volumes, had already been christened geodesia, as distinct from geometry. Philistion of Italian Locri, at the beginning of the century, practiced animal dissection and called the heart the main regulator of life, the seat of the pneuma, or soul. Diocles of Euboean Charistus, about 370, dissected the womb of animals, described human embryos of 27 to 40 days, advanced anatomy, embryology, gynecology, and obstetrics, and scotched a favorite Greek error by announcing that both sexes contribute seed to form the embryo. A second Aspasia became one of the famous physicians of 4th century Athens, renowned for her work in women's diseases, surgery, and other branches of medicine. And lest medical science should lower the death rate too fast for the means of subsistence, Aeneas Tacticus, the Arcadian, published about 360, in time for Philip and Alexander, the first Greek classic on the art of war. 2. The Socratic Schools. 1. Aristippus. If it was a middling age in science, the 4th century was the heyday of philosophy. The early thinkers had propounded vague cosmologies. The sophists had doubted everything but rhetoric. Socrates had raised 1,000 questions and answered none. Now all the seeds that had been planted in 200 years sprouted into great systems of metaphysical, ethical, and political speculation. Athens, too poor to maintain its state medical service, nevertheless opened private universities that made it, as Isocrates said, the school of Hellas, the intellectual capital and arbiter of Greece. Having weakened the old religion, the philosophers struggled to find in nature and reason some substitute for it as a prop of morals and a guide to life. They explored first the paths opened up by Socrates. While the sophists relapsed for the most part into the teaching of rhetoric and disappeared as a class, the pupils of Socrates became the storm centers of violently divergent philosophies. Euclides of Megara, who had often traveled to Athens to hear Socrates, stirred up his native city with a rage of disputes, as Timon of Athens phrased it, and developed the dialectic of Zeno and Socrates into an eristic, or art of argument, that questioned every conclusion and led in the next century to the skepticism of Pyrrho and Carneades. After Euclides' death, His brilliant disciple Stilpo led the Megarian school more and more towards the Cynic point of view. Since every philosophy can be refuted, wisdom lies not in metaphysical speculation, but in such simple living as will liberate the individual from dependence upon the external factors in well-being. When, after the sack of Megara, Demetrius Poliorcetes inquired how much Stilpo had lost, the sage replied that he had never possessed anything but knowledge, and no one had taken this away. In his later years he numbered among his students the founder of the Stoic philosophy, so that the Megarian school may be said to have begun with one Zeno and ended with another. The elegant Aristippus, after Socrates' death, traveled to various cities, spent some time with Xenophon at Scylla, but more with Laius in Corinth, and then settled down to found a school of philosophy in his native Cyrene on the coast of Africa. The wealth and luxury of the upper classes in the half-oriental city had formed his habits, and he agreed most with that part of his master's doctrine which called happiness the greatest good. Handsome in figure, refined in manners, clever in speech, he made a way for himself everywhere. Shipwrecked and penniless in Rhodes, he went to a gymnasium, discoursed, and so fascinated the men there that they provided him and his companions with all comforts. Whereupon he remarked that parents should arm their children with such wealth that even after a shipwreck it should be able to swim to land with its owner. His philosophy was simple and candid. Whatever we do, said Aristippus, is done through hope of pleasure or fear of pain, even when we impoverish ourselves for our friends or give our lives for our generals. Therefore, by common consent, pleasure is the ultimate good, and everything else, including virtue and philosophy, must be judged according to its capacity to bring us pleasure. Our knowledge of things is uncertain. All that we know directly and surely is our feelings. Wisdom, then, lies in the pursuit not of abstract truth, but of pleasurable sensations. The keenest pleasures are not intellectual or moral, they are physical or sensual. Therefore the wise man will seek physical delights above all. Nor will he sacrifice a present good to a conjectural future good. Only the present exists, and the present is probably as good as the future, if not better. The art of life lies in plucking pleasures as they pass, and making the most of what the moment gives. The use of philosophy is that it may guide us not away from pleasures, but to the most pleasant choice and use of them. It is not the ascetic who abstains that is pleasure's master, but rather the man who enjoys pleasures without being their slave, and can prudently distinguish between those that endanger him and those that do not. Hence the wise man will show a discriminating respect for public opinion and the laws, but will seek as far as possible to be neither the master nor the slave of any man. If it is a credit to a man that he practices what he preaches, Aristippus deserves some honor. He bore poverty and riches with equal grace, but made no pretense to impartiality between them. He insisted on being paid for his instructions, and did not hesitate to flatter tyrants to gain his end. He smiled patiently when Dionysius I spat upon him. A fisherman, he said, must put up with more moisture than this to catch even a smaller fish. When a friend reproached him for kneeling before Dionysius, he answered that it was not his fault if the king had his ears in his feet. And when Dionysius asked him why philosophers haunt the doors of the rich, but the rich do not frequent the presence of philosophers, he replied, because the first know what they want, but the second do not. Nevertheless, he despised men who pursued wealth for its own sake. When the rich Phrygian Simus displayed to him an ornate house paved with marble, Aristippus spat in his face, and when Simus protested, he excused himself on the ground that he could not find amid all this marble a more suitable place to spit in. Having made money, he spent it lavishly on good food, good clothing, good lodging, and, as they seemed to him, good women. Being reproved for living with a courtesan, he answered that he had no objection to living in a house or sailing in a ship that other men had used before him. When his mistress said to him, "I am in a family way by you," he replied, "You can no more tell that it was I than you could tell after going through a thicket which thorn had scratched you." People liked him despite his honest ways, for he was a person of pleasant manner, refined culture, pacey Simus, and kindly heart. Doubtless his blunt hedonism was in part due to his delight in scandalizing the respectable sinners of the town. He gave himself away by reverencing Socrates, loving philosophy, and confessing that the most impressive spectacle in life is the sight of a virtuous man steadily pursuing his course in the midst of vicious people. Before his death in 356, he remarked that the greatest legacy he was leaving to his daughter Arete was that he had taught her to set a value on nothing that she can do without, a strange surrender to Diogenes. She succeeded him as head of the Cyrenaic school, wrote 40 books, had many distinguished pupils, and earned from her city an honorable epitaph, the Light of Hellas. 2. Diogenes. Antisthenes agreed with the conclusion, but not the arguments of this philosophy, and drew out of the same Socrates an ascetic theory of life. The founder of the Cynic school was the son of an Athenian citizen and a Thracian slave. He fought bravely at Tanagra in 426. He studied for a time with Gorgias and Prodicus, and then set up his own school. But having heard Socrates discourse, he went over, taking his pupils with him to learn the wisdom of the older man. Like Eudoxus, he lived at the Piraeus and walked to Athens nearly every day, 4 or 5 miles each way. Perhaps he was present when Socrates or Plato discussed with a complacent interlocutor the problem of pleasure. Socrates. Do you think that the philosopher ought to care about the pleasures of eating and drinking? Simmias. Certainly not. Socrates. And what do you say of the pleasures of love? Should he care about them? Simmias. By no means. Socrates. And will he think much of the other ways of indulging the body, for example, the acquisition of costly raiment, or sandals, or other adornments of the body? Instead of caring about these, does he not rather despise anything beyond what nature needs? Simmias. I should say that the true philosopher would despise them. This is the essence of the Cynic philosophy, to reduce the things of the flesh to bare necessities in order that the soul may be as free as possible. Antisthenes took the doctrine literally and became a Greek Franciscan without theology. Aristippus's motto was, I possess but am not possessed. Antisthenes's was, I do not possess in order not to be possessed. He had no property, and dressed in so ragged a cloak that Socrates twitted him, I can see your vanity, Antisthenes, through the holes of your cloak. Aside from this, his only weakness was the writing of books, of which he left 10. One of them was a history of philosophy. After Socrates died, Antisthenes resumed his role as teacher. He chose as his lecture center the Gymnasium Cynosarges, or Dogfish, because it was maintained for people of low or alien or illegitimate birth. The name Cynic became attached to the school rather from the place than from the creed. Antisthenes dressed like a workman, took no pay for his teaching, and preferred the poor for his pupils. Anyone unwilling to practice poverty and hardship was driven away by Antisthenes's tongue or his club. He refused at first to take Diogenes as a pupil. Diogenes insisted, bore insult patiently, was received, and made his teacher's doctrine famous throughout Hellas by living it completely. Antisthenes had been half slave in origin. Diogenes was a bankrupt banker from Sinope. Diogenes had begged from actual want, and was pleased to learn that this was a part of virtue and wisdom. He adopted the beggar's garb, wallet, and staff, and for a time made his home in a tub or cask in the court of the temple of Cybele at Athens. He envied the simple life of animals and tried to imitate it. He slept on the ground, ate what he could find wherever he found it, and, we are assured, performed the duties of nature and the rites of love in the sight of all. Seeing a child drink from its hands, he threw away his cup. Sometimes he carried a candle or a lantern, saying that he was looking for a man. He injured no one, but refused to recognize laws, and announced himself, long before the Stoics, a cosmopolites, or citizen of the world. He traveled leisurely, and we hear of him living for a time in Syracuse. On one of his journeys he was captured by pirates, who sold him as a slave to Xeniades of Corinth. When his owner asked him what he could do, he answered, govern men. Xeniades made him a tutor of his sons and manager of his household, in which capacities Diogenes did so well that his master called him a good genius, and took his advice in many things. Diogenes continued to live his simple life so consistently that he became, next to Alexander, the most famous man in Greece. He was something of a poseur, and evidently relished his renown. He had a gift for debate, and his namesake reports that he never lost an argument. He called freedom of speech the greatest of social goods, and made much use of it with coarse humor and unfailing wit. He rebuked a woman who knelt with head to the ground before a holy image. Are you not afraid, he asked her, to be in so indecent an attitude when some god may be behind you, for every place is full of them? When he saw the son of a courtesan throw a stone at a crowd, he warned him, take care lest you hit your father. He disliked women and despised men who behaved like them. When a richly dressed and perfumed young Corinthian asked him a question, he said, I will not answer you until you tell me whether you are a boy or a girl. All the world knows the story of how Alexander at Corinth came upon Diogenes lying in the sun. I am Alexander the great king, said the ruler. "I am Diogenes the dog," said the philosopher. "Ask of me any favor you choose," said the king. "Stand out of the sun," answered Diogenes. "If I were not Alexander," said the young warrior, "I would be Diogenes." But we do not hear that the philosopher returned the compliment. The two men died, we are asked to believe, on the same day in 323, Alexander at Babylon in his 33rd year, Diogenes at Corinth in his 90s. The Corinthians placed a marble dog over his grave, and Sinope, which had banished him, raised a monument to his memory. Nothing could be clearer than the Cynic philosophy. It dallied with logic only long enough to dismiss as moonshine that theory of ideas with which Plato was bewildering the intellectuals of Athens. Metaphysics, too, seemed to the Cynics a vain game. We should study nature not in order to explain the world, which is impossible, but that we may learn the wisdom of nature as a guide to life. The only real philosophy is ethics. The aim of life is happiness, but this is to be found not in the pursuit of pleasure, but in a simple and natural life, independent as possible from all external aids. For though pleasure is legitimate if it results from one's own labor and effort, and is not followed by remorse, yet it so often eludes us in the chase or disappoints us when captured that it may more wisely be called an evil than a good. A modest and virtuous life is the only road to abiding content. Wealth destroys peace, and envious desire, like a rust, eats away the soul. Slavery is unjust but unimportant. The sage will find it as easy to be happy in bondage as in freedom. Only internal freedom counts. The gods, said Diogenes, gave man an easy existence, but man has complicated it by itching for luxuries. Not that the Cynics put much faith in the gods. When a priest explained to Antisthenes how many good things the virtuous will enjoy after death, he asked, "Why then do you not die?" Diogenes smiled at the mysteries, and remarked of the offerings set up in Samothrace by those who had survived shipwreck, the offerings would have been much more numerous if those who were lost had offered them instead of those who were saved. Everything in religion but the practice of virtue seemed to the Cynics superstition. Virtue must be accepted as its own reward and should not depend upon the existence or justice of the gods. Virtue consists in eating, possessing, and desiring as little as possible, drinking only water, and injuring no one. Asked how to defend oneself against an adversary, Diogenes answered, by proving honorable and upright. Only sexual desire seemed reasonable to the Cynics. They avoided marriage as an external bond, but patronized prostitutes. Diogenes advocated free love and a community of wives, and Antisthenes, seeking independence in everything, complained that he could not satisfy his hunger as solitarily as he could assuage his lust. Having accepted sexual desire as normal and natural, like hunger, the Cynics professed themselves unable to understand why men should be ashamed to satisfy the one appetite, like the other, in public. Even in death a man should be independent, choosing for it his own place and time. Suicide is legitimate. Diogenes, some say, killed himself by holding his breath. The Cynic philosophy was part of a back-to-nature movement which arose in 5th century Athens as a reaction of maladjustment to an irksomely complex civilization. Men are not civilized by nature and bear the restraints of ordered life only because they fear punishment or solitude. Diogenes stood to Socrates in somewhat the same relation as Rousseau to Voltaire. He thought that civilization was a mistake, and that Prometheus had deserved his crucifixion for bringing it to mankind. The Cynics, like the Stoics and Rousseau, idealized nature peoples. Diogenes tried to eat meat raw because cooking was unnatural. The best society, he thought, would be one without artifices or laws. The Greeks smiled upon the Cynics and tolerated them as medieval society tolerated its saints. After Diogenes, the Cynics became a religious order without religion. They made a rule of poverty, lived on alms, tempered their celibacy with promiscuity, and opened schools of philosophy. They had no homes, but taught and slept in the street or the temple porticos. Through Diogenes's disciples, Stilpo and Crates, the Cynic doctrine passed down into the Hellenistic age and formed the basis of Stoicism. The school disappeared as an entity about the end of the 3rd century, but its influence remained strong in the Greek tradition and perhaps reappeared in the Essenes of Judea and the monks of early Christian Egypt. How far all these movements were influenced by or influenced similar sects in India, scholarship cannot yet say. The back-to-nature devotees of our own day are the intellectual descendants of these men and women of Oriental or Greek antiquity who, tired of unnatural and cramping restraints, thought that they could turn and live with the animals. No full life is without a touch of this urban fantasy. 3. Plato. 1. The teacher. Even Plato was moved by the Cynic ideal. In the second book of the Republic, he describes with relish and sympathy a communistic and naturalistic utopia. He rejects it and goes on to portray a second-best state. But when he comes to picture his philosopher kings, we find the Cynic dream of men without property and without wives, dedicated to plain living and high philosophy, capturing the citadel of the finest imagination in Greek history. Plato's plan for a communistic aristocracy was the brilliant endeavor of a rich conservative to reconcile his scorn of democracy with the radical idealism of his time. He came of a family so ancient that on his mother's side his pedigree went back to Solon, and on his father's side to the early kings of Athens, even to Poseidon, god of the sea. His mother was the sister of Charmides and the niece of Critias, so that opposition to democracy was almost in his blood. Named Aristocles, vast and renowned, the youth distinguished himself in almost every field. He excelled in the study of music, mathematics, rhetoric, and poetry. He charmed the women and doubtless the men with his good looks. He wrestled at the Isthmian Games and was nicknamed Platon, or Broad, because of his robust frame. He fought in 3 battles and won a prize for bravery. He wrote epigrams, amorous verses, and a tragic tetralogy. He was hesitating between poetry and politics as a career when, at the age of 20, he succumbed to the fascination of Socrates. He must have known him before, since the great gadfly had long been a friend of his uncle Charmides. But now he could understand Socrates' teaching and enjoy the sight of the old man tossing ideas like an acrobat into the air and impaling them on the prongs of his questioning. He burned his poems, forgot Euripides, athletics, and women, and followed the master as if under a hypnotic spell. Perhaps he took notes every day, following with an artist's sensitivity the dramatic possibilities of this grotesque and lovable Silenus. Then, when Plato was 23, came the Tory Revolution of 404, led by his own relatives, the 10 stays of the oligarchic terror, and the brave defiance of the 30 by Socrates, the death of Critias and Charmides, the restoration of the democracy, the trial and death of Socrates. All the world seemed to collapse about the once carefree youth, and he fled from Athens as if it were a haunted city. He found some comfort at Megara in the home of Euclides, and then at Cyrene, perhaps with Aristippus. Thence he appears to have gone to Egypt and studied the mathematical and historical lore of the priests. About 395 he was back in Athens, and a year later fought for the city at Corinth. About 387 he set forth again, studied the Pythagorean philosophy with Archytas at Terrace, and with Timaeus at Locri, passed over to Sicily to see Mount Etna, formed a friendship with Dion of Syracuse, was introduced to Dionysius I, was sold into slavery, and was back safe in Athens in 386. With the 3,000 drachmas raised to reimburse his ransomer, and which Anicetus refused, Plato's friends now bought for him a suburban recreation grove named from its local god Academus. And there Plato founded the university that was destined to be the intellectual center of Greece for 900 years. The Academy was technically a religious fraternity, or theosos, dedicated to the worship of the Muses. The students paid no fees, but as they came for the most part from upper-class families, their parents could be expected to make substantial donations to the institution. Rich men, says Suidas, from time to time bequeathed in their wills to the members of the school the means of living a life of philosophic leisure. Dionysius II was reported to have given Plato 80 talents, or $480,000, which might explain the philosopher's patience with the king. The comic poets of the time satirized the students as affected in their manners and over-nice in their dress, with elegant caps and canes, and a short cloak or academic gown. So old are the manners of Eton and the black robes of scholarship. Women were admitted to the student body, for Plato remained to this extent a radical that he was an ardent feminist. The chief studies were mathematics and philosophy. Over the portal was a warning inscription, "Let no one without geometry enter here." Perhaps a considerable measure of mathematics formed a requirement for admission. Most of the mathematical advances of the 4th century were made by men who had studied in the academy. The mathematical course included arithmetic, or theory of number, advanced geometry, spheric, or astronomy, music, probably including literature and history, law, and philosophy. Moral and political philosophy came last, if Plato followed the advice which, half justifying Anytus and Meletus, he puts into the mouth of Socrates. Socrates: "You know that there are certain principles about justice and good which were taught us in childhood. and under their parental authority we have been brought up obeying and honoring them. Glaucon. That is true. Socrates. And there are also opposite maxims and habits of pleasure which flatter and attract our soul, but they do not influence those who have any sense of right, and who continue to honor the maxims of their fathers and obey them. Glaucon. True. Socrates. Now, when a man is in this state, and the questioning spirit asks what is fair and honorable, and he answers as the law directs, and then arguments come and refute the word of the legislator, and he is driven into believing that nothing is fair any more than foul, or just and good any more than the opposite, and the same of all his time-honored notions, do you think that he will still honor and obey them? Glaucon. That is impossible. Socrates. And when he ceases to think them honorable and natural as heretofore, and he fails to discover the true, can he be expected to pursue any life other than that which flatters his desires? Glaucon. He cannot. Socrates. And from being an observer of the law he is converted into a lawless person? Glaucon. Unquestionably. Socrates. Therefore every care must be taken in introducing our 30-year-old citizens to dialectic. They must not be allowed to taste the dear delight too early. That is one thing specially to be avoided. For young men, as you may have observed, when they first get the taste in their mouths, argue for amusement, and are always contradicting and refuting others in imitation of those who refute them. They are like puppy dogs, who delight to tear and pull at all who come near them. Glaucon. Yes, that is their great delight. Socrates. And when they have made many conquests and received defeats at the hands of many, they violently and speedily get into a way of not believing anything that they believed before, and hence philosophy has a bad name with the rest of the world. Glaucon. That is very true. Socrates. But when a man begins to get older, he will no longer be guilty of that sort of insanity. He will follow the example of the reasoner who is seeking for truth, and not of the eristic who is contradicting for the sake of amusement, and the greater consideration of his character will increase and not diminish the honor of the pursuit. Plato and his aides taught by lecturing, by dialogue, and by setting problems to the students. One problem was to find the uniform and ordered movements by the assumption of which the apparent motions of the planets can be accounted for. Possibly Eudoxus and Heraclides derived some stimulus from these tasks. The lectures were technical and sometimes disappointed those who had hoped for practical gain, but pupils like Aristotle, Demosthenes, Lycurgus, Hyperides, and Xenocrates were deeply influenced by them, and in many cases published the notes they had taken. Antiphanes said humorously that just as in a far northern city words froze into ice as they were spoken, and were heard in the summer when they thawed, so the words spoken by Plato to his students in their youth were finally understood by them only in their old age. 2. The Artist. Plato himself professed never to have written any technical treatises, and Aristotle refers to the teaching in the Academy as Plato's unwritten doctrine. How far this differed from the teaching of the dialogues we do not know. Probably these were undertaken originally as a recreation and in a half-humorous vein. It is one of the playful ironies of history that the philosophical works most reverenced and studied in European and American universities today were composed in an attempt to make philosophy intelligible to the layman by binding it up with human personality. It was not the first time that philosophical dialogues had been written. Zeno of Elea and several others had used this method, and Simon of Athens, a leather cutter, had published in dialogue a report of the Socratic conversations held in his shop. It was in Plato a literary, not an historical form. He did not pretend to give accurate accounts of conversations held 30 or 50 years before, nor even to keep his references consistent. Gorgias, as well as Socrates, was astounded to hear the words that the young dramatist philosopher had put into his mouth. The dialogues were written independently of one another, and perhaps at long intervals. We must not be shocked by slips of memory, much less by changes of view. There is no design unifying the whole except as the continuing search of a visibly developing mind for a truth which it never finds. The dialogues are cleverly and yet poorly constructed. They vivify the drama of ideas and build up a coherent and affectionate portrait of Socrates, but they seldom achieve unity or continuity. They often wander from subject to subject, and they are frequently cast into a clumsily indirect mood by being presented as narrative reports by one man of other men's conversations. Socrates tells us that he has a wretched memory, and then recites to a friend verbatim 54 pages of a discussion which he had carried on in his youth with Protagoras. Most of the dialogues are weakened by the absence of vigorous interlocutors capable of saying to Socrates something other than yes or its equivalent. But these faults are lost in the clear brilliance of the language, the humor of situation, expression, and ideas, the living world of varied characters humanly realized, and the frequent opening of windows into a profound and noble mind. We may judge the value that the ancients unconsciously put upon these dialogues when we consider that they are the most complete product that has come down to us from any Greek author. Their form entitles them to as high a place in the annals of literature as their content has given them in the history of thought. The earlier dialogues are excellent examples of the youthful eristic condemned in the passage quoted a while back, but they are redeemed by the charming picture they give of Athenian youth. The Symposium is the masterpiece of its genre and the best introduction to Plato. Its dramatic mise-en-scène, "Imagine," says Agathon to his servants, "that you are our hosts and that I and the company are your guests." Its living picture of Aristophanes, hiccuping because he had eaten too much, its lively episode of the drunken and scandalous Alcibiades, above all, its subtle combination of merciless realism in the portrayal of Socrates with the loftiest idealism in his conception of love, these qualities make the Symposium one of the peaks in the history of prose. The Phaedo is more subdued and more beautiful. Here the main argument, however weak, is honest and gives its opponents a fair chance. The style flows more smoothly over a scene whose noble calm overcomes its tragedy, making the death of Socrates come as quietly as the turn of a river out of sight around a bend. Part of the dialogue of the Phaedrus takes place on the banks of the Ilissus, while Socrates and his pupil are cooling their feet in the stream. Greatest of all dialogues, of course, is the Republic, being the fullest exposition of Plato's philosophy, and in its earlier parts a dramatic conflict of personalities and ideas. The Parmenides is the worst specimen of empty logic-chopping in all literature, and the bravest example in the history of philosophy of a thinker irrefutably refuting his own most beloved doctrine, the theory of ideas. Then in the later dialogues, the artistry of Plato wanes, Socrates fades from the picture, metaphysics loses its poetry, politics its youthful ideals, until in the Laws, the weary inheritor of all the culture of many-sided Athens surrenders to the lure of Sparta and gives up freedom and poetry and art and philosophy itself. 3. The Metaphysician. There is no system in Plato, and if here for order's sake his ideas are summarized under the classic heads of logic, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and politics, it should be remembered that Plato himself was too intense a poet to shackle his thought in a frame. Because he is a poet, he has most difficulty with logic. He wanders about seeking definitions and loses his way in perilous analogies. Then we got into a labyrinth, and when we thought we were at the end, came out again at the beginning, having still to see as much as ever. He concludes, "I am not certain whether there is such a science of science as logic at all." Nevertheless, he makes a beginning. He examines the nature of language and derives it from imitative sound. He discusses analysis and synthesis, analogies and fallacies. He accepts induction but prefers deduction. He creates, even in these popular dialogues, technical terms, essence, power, action, passion, generation, which will be useful to later philosophy. He names 5 of the 10 categories which will make up part of Aristotle's fame. He rejects the sophist view that the senses are the best test of truth, that the individual man is the measure of all things. If that were so, he argues, any man's, any sleeper's, any madman's, any baboon's report of the world would be as good as any other. All that the rabble of the senses gives us is a Heraclitean flux of change. If we had only sensations, we should never have any knowledge or truth at all. Knowledge is possible through ideas, through generalized images and forms that mold the chaos of sensation into the order of thought. If we could be conscious only of individual things, thought would be impossible. We learn to think by grouping things into classes according to their likenesses and expressing the class as a whole by a common noun. Man enables us to think of all men, table of all tables, light of every light that ever shone on land or sea. These ideas are not objective to the senses, but they are real to thought, for they remain and are unchanged, even when all the sense objects to which they correspond are destroyed. Men are born and die, but man survives. Every individual triangle is only imperfectly a triangle, sooner or later passes away, and therefore is relatively unreal. But triangle, the form and law of all triangles, is perfect and everlasting. All mathematical forms are ideas, eternal and complete. Everything that geometry says of triangles, circles, squares, cubes, spheres, would remain true and therefore real, even if there had never been and never would be any such figures in the physical world. Abstractions are also real in this sense. Individual acts of virtue have a brief existence, but virtue remains as a permanent reality for thought, and an instrument of thought. So with beauty, largeness, likeness, and so forth. These are as real to the mind as beautiful, large, or like things are real to the sense. The individual acts or things are what they are by partaking of and more or less realizing these perfect forms or ideas. The world of science and philosophy is composed not of individual things, but of ideas. History, as distinct from biography, is the story of man. Biology is the science not of specific organisms, but of life. Mathematics is the study not of concrete things, but of number, relation, and form, independently of things, and yet as valid for all things. Philosophy is the science of ideas. Everything in Plato's metaphysics turns upon the theory of ideas. God, the prime mover unmoved, or soul of the world, moves and orders all things according to the eternal laws and forms, the perfect and changeless ideas which constitute, as the Neoplatonists would say, the logos, or divine wisdom or mind of God. The highest of the ideas is the good. Sometimes Plato identifies this with God himself. More often it is the guiding instrument of creation, the supreme form towards which all things are drawn. To perceive this good, to vision the molding ideal of the creative process, is the loftiest goal of knowledge. Motion and creation are not mechanical. They require in the world as in ourselves a soul or principle of life as their originative power. Only that which has power is real. Therefore matter is not basically real, but is merely a principle of inertia, a possibility waiting for God or soul to give it specific form and being according to some idea. The soul is the self-moving force in man and is part of the self-moving soul of all things. It is pure vitality, incorporeal and immortal. It existed before the body and has brought with it from antecedent incarnations many memories which, when awakened by new life, are mistaken for new knowledge. All mathematical truths, for example, are innate in this way. Teaching merely arouses the recollection of things known by the soul many lives ago. After death, the soul or principle of life passes into other organisms, higher or lower according to the deserts it has earned in its previous avatars. Perhaps the soul that has sinned goes to a purgatory or hell, and the virtuous soul goes to the islands of the blessed. When through various existences the soul has been purified of all wrongdoing, it is freed from reincarnation and mounts to a paradise of everlasting happiness. 4. The Moralist. Plato knows that many of his readers will be skeptics, and for a while he struggles to find a natural ethic that shall stir men's souls to righteousness without relying on heaven, purgatory, and hell. The dialogues of his middle period turn more and more from metaphysics to morals and politics. The greatest and fairest sort of wisdom by far is that which is concerned with the ordering of states and families. The problem of ethics lies in the apparent conflict between individual pleasure and social good. Plato presents the problem fairly and puts into the mouth of Callias as strong an argument for selfishness as any immoralist has ever given. He recognizes that many pleasures are good, intelligence is needed to discriminate between good and harmful pleasures, and for fear that intelligence may come too late, we must inculcate in the young a habit of temperance, a sense of the golden mean. The soul or principle of life has 3 levels or parts: desire, will, and thought. Each part has its own virtue: moderation, courage, and wisdom, to which should be added piety and justice, the fulfillment of one's obligations to his parents and his gods. Justice may be defined as the cooperation of the parts in a whole, of the elements in a character, or of the people in a state, each part performing its fittest function properly. The good is neither reason alone nor pleasure alone, but that mingling of them in proportion and measure which produces the life of reason. The supreme good lies in pure knowledge of the eternal forms and laws. Morally, the highest good is the power or faculty, if there be such, which the soul has of loving the truth and of doing all things for the sake of truth. He who so loves truth will not care to return evil for evil. He will think it better to suffer injustice than to do it. He will go forth by sea and land to seek after men who are incorruptible, whose acquaintance is beyond price. The true votaries of philosophy abstain from all fleshly lusts, and when philosophy offers them a purification and release from evil, they feel that they ought not to resist her influence. To her they incline, and whither she leads they follow her. Plato had burned his poems and lost his religious faith, but he remained a poet and a worshipper. His conception of the good was suffused with aesthetic emotion and ascetic piety. Philosophy and religion became one in him. Ethic and aesthetic were fused. As he grew older, he became incapable of seeing any beauty apart from goodness and truth. He would censor in his ideal state all art and poetry that might seem to the government to have an immoral or unpatriotic tendency. All rhetoric and all non-religious drama would be barred. Even Homer, seductive painter of an immoral theology, would have to go. The Dorian and Phrygian modes of music might be allowed, but there must be no complicated instruments, no virtuosos making a beastly noise with their technical displays, and no radical novelties. The introduction of a new kind of music must be shunned as imperiling the whole state, for styles of music are never disturbed without affecting the most important political institutions. The new style, gradually gaining a lodgment, quietly insinuates itself into manners and customs, and from these it goes on to attack laws and constitutions, displaying the utmost impudence until it ends by overturning everything. Beauty, like virtue, lies in fitness, symmetry, and order. A work of art should be a living creature, with head, trunk, and limbs all vitalized and unified by one idea. True beauty, thinks our passionate Puritan, is intellectual rather than physical. The figures of geometry are eternally and absolutely beautiful, and the laws whereby the heavens are made are fairer than the stars. Love is the pursuit of beauty and has 3 stages, according as it is love of the body, or of the soul, or of truth. Love of the body between man and woman is legitimate as a means to generation, which is a kind of immortality. Nevertheless, this is a rudimentary form of love, unworthy of a philosopher. Physical love between man and man, or woman and woman, is unnatural and must be suppressed as frustrating reproduction. This can be done by sublimating it in the second or spiritual stage of love. Here the older man loves the younger because his comeliness is a symbol and reminder of pure and eternal beauty, and the younger loves the older because his wisdom opens a way to understanding and honor. But the highest love is the love of the everlasting possession of the good, that love which seeks the absolute beauty of the perfect and eternal ideas or forms. This, and not fleshless affection between man and woman, is Platonic love, the point at which the poet and the philosopher in Plato merge in the passionate desire for understanding, an almost mystic longing for the beatific vision of the law and structure and life and goal of the world. For he, Adeimantus, whose mind is fixed upon true being, has no time to look down upon the affairs of men, or to be filled with jealousy and enmity in the struggle against them. His eye is ever directed towards fixed and immutable principles, which he sees neither injuring nor injured by one another, but all in order, moving according to reason. These he imitates, and on these, so far as he can, he will mold his life. 5. The Utopian. Nevertheless, he is interested in the affairs of men. He sees a social vision, too, and dreams of a society in which there shall be no corruption, no poverty, no tyranny, and no war. He is appalled at the bitterness of political faction in Athens, strife and enmity and hatred and suspicion forever recurring. Like a blue blood, he despises the plutocratic oligarchy, the men of business, pretending never so much as to see those whom they have already ruined, inserting their sting, that is, their money, into anybody else who is not on his guard against them, and recovering the principal sum many times over. This is the way in which they make drones and paupers to abound in the state. And then democracy comes into being, after the poor have conquered their opponents, slaughtering some and banishing some, while to the remainder they give an equal share of freedom and power. The Democrats turn out to be as bad as the plutocrats. They use the power of their number to vote doles to the people and offices to themselves. They flatter and pamper the multitudes until liberty becomes anarchy, standards are debased by omnipresent vulgarity, and manners are coarsened by unhindered insolence and abuse. As the mad pursuit of wealth destroys the oligarchy, so the excesses of liberty destroy democracy. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.